Good morning, YouTube. Warbles on a lot here. Sunday morning, we're going to get a focus on that. Yep, just about time for Outsiders and First Dog on the Moon.
And listeners are advised that this morning's edition of the Sunday Extra Sunday paper wrap may contain traces of feral dog. Every now and then, and it's not just any Sunday, a story comes along, a story of such importance, of such urgent significance that it sweeps all before it. A story that captures every front page in the nation. Something so shocking, so compelling, so utterly, unimpeachably newsworthy that it demands national prominence. And so it is this morning that the Sunday Telegraph, the Sunday Herald Sun, Brisbane Sunday Mail, and that other beacon of fearless independent Australian journalism, the Sunday Territorian, all share the one shattering piece of news. Exclusive interview. That's the Sunday Herald Sun.
In an exclusive print interview with the Sunday Mail.
That's the Sunday Mail. But whoever got there, the result in this morning, well, the result is a News Corp chorus.
Why I love dingoes.
That's how this morning's Sunday Telegraph tells it. The astounding tale of how
the half-sister of Azaria Chamberlain, the 9-week-old baby snatched from her tent at Uluru in 1980, has become a passionate dingo advocate and is training to be a dingo handler.
You wouldn't read about it, although, of course, you would. For in an act of remarkable synchronised enthusiasm, all but two of the country's News Corp Sunday editors have taken those two words, Chamberlain and
dingo,
and thought, front, quickly followed by
page.
And there it is, a story that sells itself.
The Year 12 student has been flying to Queensland from her home in Lake Macquarie, New South Wales, to support a dingo sanctuary. Now she's spoken for the first time about her love of the species that Father Michael and his first wife Lindy fought 32 years to prove was responsible for their baby's death.
And the Sunday Herald Sun and Brisbane Sunday Mail this morning prove that, well, they are masters of that other great instinct of the tabloid journalist, the irresistible urge to, well, beat stuff up. And so it is that the curiosity of Melbourne and Brisbane readers will be piqued by the paper's promise of a
Azaria dingo twist.
The twist being, presumably, that the story has nothing to do with Azaria Chamberlain. Or as her half-sister herself puts it,
as you know, I was born a long time ago after that happened, and to a different marriage. So I've only really heard or suffered repercussions to a small degree compared to any of my other siblings.
So there you are.
And the only thing I can really say has truly impacted me would be when anonymous members of the public bludgeoned to death my rabbits in 2009.
Good Lord.
And close to that event, someone, or it could have been the same person, had left a nasty message on our doorstep signed by the dingo paw.
We'll leave Zara Chamberlain and the paw there while saluting the restraint and respect for accuracy that lies behind the headline hogging page 1 of the Sunday Telegraph this morning. A paper that today proves itself to be, momentarily, the model of restraint. A paper that resisted the temptation of
Azaria dingo twist
and instead settled on
Why I Love Dingo,
which, while still a dog of a story, nonetheless has simple, unexaggerated truth on its side. Yes.
Tweet of the week.
Oh, yes, indeed. Now, did our mystery tweeter sound familiar to you? Have another listen. That sound familiar? I wonder if it did. It was a yellow-tailed black cockatoo. Yes, it was. That was the mystery tweeter. And a lot of you tweeted in an absolutely correct response. We were very much impressed by how many people recognised that piece of birdsong, but there can only be one winner. Leonie from Gippsland was the first in to identify Calyptorhynchus funereus, something like that. It's the yellow-tailed black cockatoo. They're big birds, but you'll probably hear them before seeing them, and you will hear the noise that we just played. They're in noisy flocks, pretty big flocks. They're searching for pine cones, the seeds of native trees. There you go. There'll be another mystery tweeter. Tweet of the week next week on RN Sunday Extra, just after the 9 o'clock news. Time now for Outsiders. I'm Barry Cassidy, and you're not. Now, if anybody out there knows of the whereabouts of Jane Gilmore, editor of King's Tribune, well, tell her that she should be here, because she's not, and we were hoping she would be. Never mind, we will soldier on, because we're joined this morning by Roger Franklin, editor of Quadrant Online, and Dr. Mark Triffett. He's the former Director of Strategic Communications for the Business Council of Australia, now lectures in public policy. Say that word 10 times, Mark, without public policy at the University of Melbourne. Welcome to you both.
Good morning, John.
Let's have a bit of we're here to talk the 12 months that have been. Let's do some quick recall.
Axe the tax. Stop the boats. Operation Bring Them Home. Everyone has got to be on Team Australia.
And there we have it. There's a quick summary of the politics of the past 12 months. Thank you. That's all. No, we should talk about it, really. Mark, it's been an extraordinary year. We had a government which came to power with a very simple premise, series of premises, which it's by and large fulfilled.
Yeah, I think that's right. And as you say, it's certainly not been a dull year. I think the way that I would sum it up is the more it changes, the more it stays the same. You're absolutely right, Jonathan. I think the government has delivered on some key promises in terms of stop the boats and axe the tax. But I think the broader narrative they were elected on was on the basis of bringing or restoring a trust into the political and policy culture. They made obviously a big play on the broken carbon tax promise by the previous Prime Minister, and then promised not to do the same. And I think when we look back on the legacy of the last 12 months, the thing I think that's still resonating, will continue to resonate for the next couple of years at least anyway, is this idea that the government hasn't really necessarily restored integrity in behind those decision processes.
It's a good point, Roger. I mean, here we had the 6 years previous to the Abbott election were marked by those sort of issues of trust and turmoil, and Tony Abbott comes to power promising truth and maturity. We got that?
Adult government.
That's the one.
Well, we haven't had any ministers proclaiming that they have the authority to make people wear red underpants on their head. We haven't had a government that feels obliged to support a brothel creeper because it's the cornerstone on which its continuing sovereignty remain. We've had generally sensible government. We have had broken promises, there's no doubt about that, most notably 18C. But on the whole, I would think after 6 years of, as you say, turmoil, childish antics, posturing, broken promises, it's a refreshing change. It may not be perfect, but it's better than what we had.
18C is one thing, Mark. I mean, it's been the suite of other issues around the budget.
Health, no
cuts to health. I mean, and that's fudged by the fiddling of words that cut the rate of increase. So to the government, that doesn't count as a cut. But there's an issue there of, and this goes particularly to the budget, of having a story to sell and not perhaps being all that convincing in the selling of it.
Yeah, I think there's a number of issues tied up with this in terms of how constituents expect that politicians behave in this day and age. I mean, no one's disputing that they don't have a tough job. Preparing the budget and those sorts of things are not easy. But I think, as you say, Jonathan, I mean, to say before the election that a number of things won't happen and then after the election that they do happen, I think has created a sense of distrust with the government, which I think they'll have to live with for the next couple of years.
Is there a sense, Roger? I mean, you raised 18C there, and I know that's a particular bugbear of yours, and
it should be a bugbear of everybody who cares about free speech.
Is there an issue for this government? I mean, we expect governments to alienate people that oppose them politically, but the Abbott government has also done a fair bit to alienate the base, and in particular the right of its constituency.
Yeah. I've heard people actually saying that this is the end of them as far as Abbott is concerned. And if you go back 2 years to August 2012, Abbott addressed the IPA and pledged himself in no uncertain terms to the revoking of 18C, which is an obscenity. The only thing we need is a version of the American First Amendment, which is keep your hands off free speech. That's it. So what it turns around, and for reasons of dubious political expedience, a way to get the Muslim community on board, he comes up with this absurdity called Team Australia. And in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to affect whether the sun comes up tomorrow or where the government functions go. But as a core issue, as a key principle, free speech and the right to be a bigot, as George Brand has said, and the right to say to someone that you're an idiot, which is the response to bigotry, right? And that's how free speech works. It's such a sacrosanct principle, it still astonishes me that he could have turned around and done that.
But it's broader than that too, isn't it? I mean, it's not just 18C. I mean, there's a range of issues on which many would wish that the government was tougher economically, was tougher in a budgetary sense as well, and that they have this strange pair of risks that in not being tough in a budgetary sense, they alienate the right of conservative Australia. In being as tough as they alienate the left of political Australia. That's kind of a bit of a political trap, I would have thought.
I don't think it would have had to have got up very early in the morning to have alienated the left in Australia. I mean, if you look at a lot of the coverage of the first 12 months, you'll see things, and you pointed to this a moment ago, where budgets are still going up at the rate of increases and what's promised, and this is depicted as a cut. Well, if the same principle was applied to climate change and temperature, we'd all be happily, all the CSIRO and all the other spoofers would all be happily saying, well, temperatures are still going up. Unfortunately, we apply that formula to the budget, and we end up with the cuts. So, I mean, that's one of the incongruities.
Sadly, Mark, we're not here to discuss climate science this morning, but we can look at this. I mean, your take on that of where the government sits itself between the two poles of opposition, if you like.
Yeah, I actually think it's a really good point. And I think it's a sign of the current times in the sense that it speaks to, I think, a broader difficulty that political parties and political leaders have in the 21st century of trying to be all things to all people. And unfortunately, as our society becomes more diverse and fluid and have a whole range of different political voices and identities, it's harder and harder for politicians to create a coherent narrative that appeals to all people. So, in one sense, it's very hard to be a politician. That's an axiomatic statement. But in this day and age, it's very easy to put people offside who are your core base because they have very high expectations of what you're supposed to deliver. And then you've got a whole constituency of swinging voters whose preferences and priorities in terms of policy will change every week. So you're in the gun as a politician all the time. I'm not expressing sympathy for any particular politician, but it is very hard to start off with a coherent narrative and to follow it through, given the fluidity of politics in this day and age.
It helps to have a guiding philosophy.
I agree. I think, Roger, that's the key. I think people respond to values, and they also respond, I think, to candour. And I think the big trap the government has fallen into is to the short-term expediency of breaking, some significant promises in the hope that the means to an end will sort itself out. But I think it creates huge difficulties for the government when they come up against things like federal-state relations, tax reform, and even if they want to go down the path of IR reform,
the big serious stuff.
Absolutely. I think they've really eroded or corroded their credibility bank on the basis of what's happened with things like the budget.
I agree with that. I think if I were to give this government any advice, it would be to look south to Victoria, where the Victorian Liberal government is in all sorts of trouble heading into the election in November. One of the reasons for that is because if you look at them, you say to yourself, well, we can have Labor or we can have Labor light. There's no philosophy evident in Spring Street. And I'd like to see that philosophy starting, as I said, with 18C and free speech as just a cornerstone of cornerstone of all democracies.
But the opportunity there for that sort of philosophy, that sort of narrative, as people would frame it now, I mean, that's, if we look ahead, that's what's coming up in these next couple of years for this government. I mean, we've got a white paper out there, for example, on tax. which presents a great opportunity for a real discussion, but only if the government can sort of lead that from a sort of philosophic position.
Yeah, I think the other problem they have at the moment in terms of perception is that they have aligned themselves very closely, for better or for worse, with some fairly linear, narrow vested interests. I mean, some of the advisors they've had on board for some key policy issues have been seen to represent a particular sexual interest, and an interest that I used to work for at the Business Council.
Well, you've shortened the line last week of you're favouring 9 mining companies over 9 million superannuation retirees.
Absolutely. I think, for better or for worse, whether it's good public policy or not, the perception and the optics are pretty bad. I think, what they need to think about in terms of tax reform and some of these bigger issues is to start framing it in much more in the public interest, but also bring in some more diverse voices. Not necessarily a free-for-all, but I mean, if people want to get on board with this and see this is not simply an exercise in favouring a few selected interests, then they have to work really hard at rebuilding those relationships, I think.
It would be really handy on the issue of tax if within the Parliamentary Liberal Party there was a ginger group arguing for a flat tax, the simplification of the virtual abolition of the ATO, and the end of the parasitic accounting industry.
Probably leave that to Clive Palmer. Well, this is Outsiders on Sunday Extra. We've got Mark Triffett and Roger Franklin. We were to have Jane Gilmore. We're distressed at her non-appearance, and we hope that she's well and happy and everything's okay. A couple of years to go, Roger, of this government. They're momentarily, or have been for some time, behind in the polls. They seem to be finding a new sort of sense of voice, especially around national security. Is that going to be enough?
Expand on that if you don't mind, Jonathan.
Well, is that going to be enough to turn their stocks around?
Well, who knows?
Tell themselves to a poll at some point.
It's 2 years until the next poll is due. When it comes to voting for them, people like myself who are disgusted at the retreat from 18C will probably hold their noses and vote in any case.
Where would you go?
Well, LDP, I suppose. But do you want to waste your vote on a party that gets in on an electoral quirk in the proportional representation system? Ideally, I'd like to see, as I said, a bit more spine and backbone and philosophical commitment in the party at the moment. I think we've seen competence in foreign affairs. We've seen the big promises covered, but I would like to see that philosophical underlay, if you like, that produces things like debates about tax policy, debates about IR.
And a couple of quick polls, Mark, that were in their favour that showed the sort of response they're getting at the moment on that would give this government confidence, I think, perhaps to find that narrative voice.
Yeah, absolutely. I think governments in this day and age, when they start off, tend to be a bit shaky because it's a big transition from opposition to government. So I think we're seeing some of that as well. But I think the point that Roger makes is very spot on. I mean, what we might see over the next couple of years if the government doesn't communicate and doesn't engage with people in a broader way is that you'll get, I think, the motivation among voters and constituents to start looking more towards micro players and micro parties, because whether through a protest vote or a view that they are a much more legitimate force than two parties that can't necessarily differentiate themselves, I think we might well see the next election a much more volatile Senate, if not a much more volatile House of Representatives.
And they're doing nothing to discourage that in terms of reform of the Senate process at the moment.
Well, and I think that's the other downside, I think, for the government by not treating the public as adults, is the sense that it's emboldened the Senate, and it's emboldened someone like Clive Palmer to the point where one of the richest people in Australia is now seen as a friend of the battler. So you've got a very active Senate, and I think you'll probably see more of that.
That will be, I suspect, the story of these next couple of years. We'll watch with interest. Thanks this morning to our dynamic duo here on Outsiders. Roger Franklin, editor of Quadrant Online. Dr. Mark Triffett, he lectures in public policy at the University of Melbourne. And we get an absentee note from Jane Gilmore, editor of King's Tribune. Jane, if you're listening, we missed you. 5 to 10. Okay.
Welcome to First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living. I'm Walkley Award-winning cartoonist for The Guardian, First Dog on the Moon. And it's the first anniversary of the Tony government. Haven't we been having a lovely time? Broken promises raining from the sky like confetti at a gay wedding in another country. But today is not just about the Prime Minister. There are other people celebrating as well. Today marks 326 days since opposition leader Beef Stocking became opposition leader. Oh, excuse me, Beef Stocking, what was I thinking? I meant shoot Ballsack. No, Bill Shorten. Bill Shorten, that's the fellow. So this is the 326th thing, the unanniversary celebration day for the leader of the Australian Labor Party. Congratulations, bub. It's tough not being the government, but it's so important that the nation has a vigorous, fearless opposition willing to hold the government to account. And we've come to expect nothing less from shrill bumbag and the opposition's front bench. Remember when Tony lied about, well, pretty much everything, but specifically no budget cuts to health, followed with a $368 million cut to preventative health measures? And how did Boss Hogtown respond? Well, he said, what a smackdown. Take that, Prime Minister. Before the election, the government promised it would fully implement the Donsky education reforms, and then afterwards, they didn't. Typical, but never fear, Tubby Spermbank rubbed the government's nose right in it when he said, or even the time Tony reckoned he'd spend the first week of his prime ministership in an Aboriginal community, and then not only didn't do it, but also said he didn't even say he wouldn't. Who could forget how the opposition leader responded? It's burned in our national memory. Let's all say it together. Or the time that the Prime Minister told us all we were going to war in Iraq, and afterwards, Bleach Stand Up looked the nation in the eye and said, whatever Tony reckons is fine with us. Did you know that falling off ladders kills more people in this country than terrorism does? But you don't hear Tony or Babs denouncing Bunnings as a hotbed of radicalism. Or how about car accidents? Kills thousands, but you don't see the government shutting down the homegrown automotive industry. Oh, wait. Of course, some of you playing at home might say that Snubbly Nitwit has responded to all the things the government have done and said, and maybe he did, but I bet none of you can remember a single word of it. I know I can't, and I'm on the radio. Till next time, thanks for listening, Patriots. This has been First Dog on the Moon's Guide to Modern Living, proudly brought to you by the First Dog on the Moon Institute.
Yep, well, I can't argue with that, can I? I cannot deny that whatever it was that Bill Shorten has said in response to Tony Abbott's performance, it's unmemorable. And I can't recall what he actually said either, apart from silence or, yeah, we'll go along with that, or something else equally inconsequential. But this last week, it's gone from the sublime to the ridiculous. Tony Abbott and Bronwyn Bishop have decided that a bunch of radical extreme Muslims who want to reform the caliphate somewhere between Libya and Iraq and Syria, that they constitute an imminent, dangerous, terrible threat to Australia, to the point where Australia has expressed a willingness to join a coalition of like-minded nations, not a coalition of the willing, but a coalition of the like-minded. And we're desperately keen to send a squadron of F-18 Super Hornets to go and carry out humanitarian airstrikes and smite the wicked. That's what Tony Abbott and Bronwyn Bishop want to do there. Meanwhile, because Australia has such a large and prominent North Atlantic seacoast, therefore Australia wants to be prominent in the contribution of troops, aircraft perhaps, maybe the same squadron of F-18 Super Hornets, to the 4,000-man North Atlantic Treaty Organisation Rapid Reaction Force, which wants to be built, stationed, created, spotted, ready to move, in order to safeguard Romania, Latvia, countries which, Poland perhaps, countries which feel that Comrade Premier Colonel Vladimir Putin may not want to stop even after he has blitzkrieged and steamrolled his way across all of Ukraine and captured Kiev, which everybody seems to think is going to be his next move. Australia wants to be a part of that. We want to be part of the NATO war against the resurgent Putin Tsarist empire. Great. In addition to the $10,000 worth of lost trade for each one of the 38 Australians who were killed when flight MH17 was shot down, we lost $400,000 worth of agricultural food exports to Russia with that one. Now we're going to stop selling them uranium. Oh, that'll teach them, won't it? You know, it's not like Russia didn't inherit the Soviet Union's nuclear stockpile. But that's cool. No drama. Tony Abbott was away talking to the Indians, Indian subcontinent, not the Redskins with a feather in their head. He's going to sell Australian uranium to India because India is not a signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but the Indians are promising that they're going to use Australian uranium only to generate electricities with, and that means they can free up their own uranium, of which they have very small amounts. They have a small uranium mining industry. But once we sell them the uranium for the electric power plants, then they'll be able to use their own uranium to enrich to build more bombs to go to war with Pakistan next time. I think the Pakistani government's undergoing some kind of a slow motion military coup at the moment, isn't it? All these governments are fixating on how they want to make the world a better place by sending out a military expeditionary force to do something to someone who offends their sensibilities. And all the while, attention is being thereby drawn away from what's actually happening. And what's actually happening is that, as it was foretold within the prophecy delivered from my little ridgetop, the oracle on the pinnacle, Ebola is going far. The World Health Organization has warned the United Nations that all nations should now be preparing for their first Ebola cases. There have been over 2,000 died, more than 3,500 cases, and as they keep saying, 40% of the cases have occurred in the last 3 weeks. I don't know whether it's Sierra Leone or Ivory Coast or Guinea or Liberia. One of them has decided that they're going to make everybody stay at home in the house for 3 days, just to stop people from cross-infecting each other, to try and give their health services a bit of a break. Other stories are coming out, like women dying in obstructed childbirth because no doctors dare to touch them because body fluids are involved. It seems to me, if it takes somebody 20 minutes to get into their protective garments before going and looking at a microscope to see whether somebody's actually got Ebola, it's not going to be long before entire health systems, whether in Africa or in the Western world, are completely run out of caps, disposable, masks, disposable, gowns. Well, when I was doing infection control and barrier nursing, the gowns were put in a special bag and sent off to the laundry for special treatment. But that was back in the days when hospitals did their own in-house laundry. Back in the days when the hospital administrator could say to the fellow who worked in the laundry, oh, the water has to be this hot, you have to do that, so much time, all these things, so that the linen that came out of the hospital laundries was pretty much sterile. Now, whoever's the lowest bid contractor gets the job. I'm pretty sure the standard response to Ebola-infected bed linen is to burn it. How long before we run out of bed sheets in the hospitals, let alone the nurses to change the bed sheets? I'm absolutely certain the tourist industry and the airline industry is resisting calls to shut down international airline travel. One of my relatives is at the moment winging his way from Sydney to Hong Kong to buy diamonds for 3 or 4 days for their family business. And I'm thinking as I heard that, gee, I wonder what proportion of the diamonds he's going to be looking at will be blood diamonds coming from the Ebola coast of Africa. And I wonder how the person who got the diamonds and took them to Hong Kong ready to sell them, I wonder how much contact that person had with somebody who may have actually been incubating the disease. The only way to contain Ebola is quarantine, and at the moment all the economists are whinging and bitching and pissing their pants because they say that quarantine, international quarantine, depresses economic growth, and that's obviously bad. You know, like, why would you try and stop a disease like Ebola when you can worry about economic growth? And in the long run, I've got to say, it's out, it's going to keep going. And if any one nation in the world was to succeed in remaining Ebola free while it sweeps and ravages the rest of the world, surely that one nation, the Ebola free nation, the one country that manages to keep it out, they're just going to wind out being at risk anywhere they go. They're going to be locked into their own borders. They'll be like the kid in the sterile room, you know, the people who are completely immunocompromised and they don't dare go outside of their filtered environment. So I think in the long run, 5 years, 10 years down the track, everybody who's alive will have immunity to Ebola. And everybody who did not have immunity to Ebola will have died. And the only treatment which is looking reasonably effective at the moment is derived from, I think, a 2009 study where 8 people who were infected with Ebola were injected with blood from people who had recovered from Ebola, and 7 out of the 8 recovered. Whereas at the moment, 54% of people die with no special treatment, just supportive care. And out of the 4 people who've been treated with the ZMapp, what are they, monoclonal antibodies from 3 different kinds of viruses, half of them have died and half of them have recovered, so that they're not doing any better than the control group. But the people who've had the blood transfusions, yes, that looks like it might be something like an effective treatment. Trouble is, you're going to require an awful lot of people who have recovered to deliver blood, and they're all probably going to be feeling fairly wasted. Maybe, you know, a month or 2 after they recover, they might be ready to give blood, but certainly not the day after they get over the disease. And I've noticed there's a bit of a trend, a fashion going on in medical research at the moment for injecting sick people with the blood of a healthy person and just letting the mysteries of the transfusion deal with all ills. One of the more bizarre incidences I saw was people who got old mice and injected them with the blood of young mice, and then measured the improvement in organ function in all kinds of organs, including the brain. They're now getting funding to inject the people with Alzheimer's with the blood from volunteers and donors who are under 30 to see whether you can cure dementia merely by a blood transfusion from somebody who's young. How long is it going to be, if this trend continues, before you get geriatric hostels full of rich old buggers who maintain kindergartens full of blood donors so that they can just keep tapping them, milking them, bleeding them, and then having themselves injected with the fountain of eternal youth from a class full of captive toddlers. I really think medical research is heading down some macabre and twisted alleyways. I know it's a logical extrapolation of doing organ transplants from people who are brain dead. But yeah, I don't see it as being a viable response to Ebola. If we were going to contain it, the time is over. People who say, oh, well, you know, the outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo is a different outbreak. It's a different strain, and the DRC has had experience of containing Ebola before, and it'll be right, they'll get on top of it. I say that's total nonsense. The Democratic Republic of Congo has only ever had experience of containing and suppressing and dealing with Ebola when it was the only country in the world that was affected, and when people were ready to fly there from all over the world, Médecins Sans Frontières, World Health Organization, UNICEF, all those were ready to help. But at the moment, Médecins Sans Frontières and the World Health Organization are completely overstretched. They're already failing in 4 or 5 other countries. They have no resources to dedicate to the DRC. So it turns out that whoever it was who said, oh, we have a viral hemorrhagic fever in the Democratic Republic of Congo, but we don't think it's Ebola. They didn't do themselves any favours, did they? They've now acquired Ebola status at a time when nobody's got any resources to throw at it because everybody's too busy worrying about how they can go and deliver humanitarian airstrikes in Iraq or get involved in Australia's North Atlantic Treaty Organisation obligations to fight Russia in the Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Australia's gulag, people whose only alleged crime is that they tried to enter Australia without papers by turning up on a boat, it's got so bad that people are dying of septicemia. An Iraqi cut his foot, got septicemia, developed toxic shock, brain dead, switched off the respirator, all over, mate. So yeah, Australia's not in a position to put much shit on North Korea while we're doing stuff like that. Air Force is involved in international gun running to banned and proscribed terrorist organisations, to wit the Kurdish PKK. And the big worry that appends to that, attaches to that, is that after Tony Abbott's gun-running Royal Australian Air Force C-17 Starlifter or Globemaster or whatever they call it is, drops the humanitarian Russian-manufactured ammunition to the proscribed banned terrorist organisation, the PKK, after they fire off a couple of magazines full of ammo in the general direction of ISIS, who by that stage have stopped being an annoyance to anybody because the Humvee will have run out of spare parts, then the PKK can turn around and recommence operations against the Turkish government. And Turkey is a member of NATO. So Tony Abbott, because he wants to get involved in an anti-Muslim caliphatic shit fight in Iraq and Syria, is literally arming the terrorists to fight with a NATO country's government. Oh, it's juicy. It's juicy. His penalty, his penance, his sentence is that he has to live with the consequences of the ridiculous shit that he's done. He's bogged himself down in. Tony Abbott's going to go down in history as the worst Prime Minister Australia's ever had. That's my prophecy. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Happy Father's Day. Ciao.